record.
Okay.
Dino, thank you so much for dedicating your time. I'd like to congratulate you for the book that you published a few days ago. I think it's another milestone in your career. And can you tell us a few words about the book that you released?
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I should kind of point out and clarify that this volume, which is published by Routledge and the Palestine Exploration Fund, which has the title Zoara 1, it's part of what's going to be 3 volumes, which essentially is our reports for the last over 20 years of work there. But overwork there. I have to say that Zoara is the ancient name, but it's the Ghor Safi, the part of Jordan at the southeastern end of the Dead Sea. So the Ghor Safi, I've been working there for about 30 years, and it's quite a rich archaeological finds. So even though this is supposed to be the first volume, and I thank you for congratulating me and for the publication, we actually have had 4 other volumes on the Ghor Safi archaeology. First of all, there's the Sanctuary of Lot, Der Nabata, which was started in 1987-88. And that's also within the Ghor Safi. It's this famous site that's now called Lot's Cave. It's on the Madaba map. So that's also part of the area. And then there are 3 other volumes on the Greek and Aramaic inscription that are published that are from the Ghor Safi, also from Zoara. So even though this is Zoara 1, there are already 4 important publications from the area. So when we finish, or when I finish, there'll be another 3. And altogether, this will really show what an important area that was at the southern end of the Dead Sea for thousands of years, actually, for thousands of years.
I mean, once during your lectures, you mentioned that the southern tip of the Dead Sea was a huge necropolis. We have thousands of graves in the Lisan Peninsula and in the area near Ghor Safi. Can you say more about that?
Yes. Well, I just said there's been publications on the Ghor Safi, but if you go a bit farther north to the famous site of Baba Dra, which is in Ghor Mazra, and Numera and Feifa, there are Bronze Age cemeteries and sites with thousands, tens of thousands of tombs. So along with the Ghor Safi tombs from the early Bronze Age now, this area of the southern Ghors, which is now an area which we can look at as a unit, not just the Ghor Safi, but Ghor Mazra, Ghor Feifa. There are hundreds of thousands of tombs from 5,000 years ago, from the period of the early Bronze Age. There are also Middle Bronze Age tombs, which is about 1,700 BC. And then there's the Byzantine tombs, which have the inscriptions, and that's about 5th, 6th century AD. So we have several cemeteries, plus there are also Nabatean cemeteries. So there's groups of cemeteries in the southern Ghors, beginning, let's say, from Mazra, Haditha, Mazra to Feifa, and Ghor Safi being the center of the area. We're probably looking at many hundreds of thousands altogether, possibly even, well, let's just say several hundred thousand from the Bronze Age up until the Byzantine period.
Can we evaluate the presence of inhabitants in that area? For how long they occupied Zoara or modern day Ghor Safi in the history? Because you mentioned the Bronze Age. Was Zoara inhabited in the Bronze Age?
Well, we just mentioned that there are very substantial cemeteries with tens of thousands, if not more, bodies from the early Bronze Age, 5,000 years ago, roughly. there are also settlements that are associated to them. There's settlements, we have some evidence of settlements in the Gor Safi, but more clear evidence in Baba Dra and Gor Mazra and Umera and Feifa. So yes, we have major early Bronze cities. It's a time when the first cities are developing with walls around them. So it's a period that archaeologists called proto-urbanism, the beginnings of city life, before the Roman and Byzantine times.
We have in your book mentioning of the human occupation spanning some 12,000 years, which is the period from 10,000 BC. What kind of evidence we have for human occupation during Neolithic time and later on Bronze Age period?
Yes, well, this part of Jordan and this part of the world really is very interesting because it's the southern end of the Dead Sea. It's the Dead Sea itself, of course, the whole Rift Valley, and the levels of the water of the Dead Sea, as we know, for the last 60,000 years, 20,000 years, has been dropping. During these periods, the shore, the coastline of the Dead Sea, is at different levels. So if we go back to 12,000 years ago, 10,000 BC, the Neolithic period, the time when there's the first kind of human settlements, they're much higher up on the plateau. So we have excavated major settlements, stone-built houses, very similar to Basta, not very far from or south of Petra, or Beda in Petra, the same type of period, the early Bronze Age, the PPNB period, and also in Amman itself at the famous Ein Ghazal site, and even Jericho. So it's all part of this Jordan Rift Valley Neolithic period. And in the Gor Safi, we have major, and Gor Mazra actually, we have major occupations that are about 10,000 BC. Now, we also have early Bronze Age, which is about 5,000 BC, major sites associated to the cemeteries. So there's these two major periods when, from the studies that have been done on the rainfall, the weather, the climate, of the Dead Sea, so when it's wetter, when there's more rainfall in the Neolithic period, about 10,000 BC, and in the Bronze Age, about 5,000 years ago, slightly wetter, you can have more agriculture, so you can feed more people, and that's when you have these settlements, the increase of human populations when there is more rain. It's kind of obvious. That's when you would be able to sustain populations.
What was the correlation between archaeological sites from both sides of the Dead Sea? Once you mentioned that the number of archaeological sites from the West Bank and East Bank can be correlated economically and socially.
Well, everything that's happening in Jordan is happening on both sides of the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley. Having said that, there is a difference, or there was a difference, and even today there is a difference in climate. Archaeology today is not just pottery and bones and inscriptions. We try to understand the environment, and it's very important to understand the environment, and we work together with geomorphologists. They're not just geologists, but these are specialists that study the ancient landscape, but during the time of human occupations, which, for instance, the last few thousand years. So one of the things that's been studied, not by myself, by many geomorphologists, or at least a number of geomorphologists, in understanding what's happening on the east and west side of the Jordan Valley and the Dead Sea, have come to this conclusion. The way the climate works from the Mediterranean, thinking of the West in Palestine, the way the climate works and the pressure, the atmospheric pressures works, more rainfall drops on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, so, which is now Jordan. Therefore, you have more springs, more fresh water. Therefore, you have more human, you can sustain more human settlements. This is going back to the, Neolithic periods and the Bronze Age periods. So if you're looking at both sides, east and west sides of the Dead Sea, for instance, Palestine and Jordan, Palestine in the west, Jordan on the east, and you look at the number of archaeological sites, there actually are more on the eastern Jordanian side because there's more rainfall, because there's more springs, and because the fresh water can sustain more human populations.
Yeah, it makes some sense. But regarding the Nabatean presence in Zoara, how significant Zoara was during Nabatean period?
Well, the Nabateans, we are only beginning to learn about them. Of course, people know Petra from the architecture, but the actual people and their lives and where they came from, even their language, which is obviously a Semitic Aramaic language, is not very clear yet. It's still really in its infancy. In many ways, we know more about the Bronze Age and late Bronze Age and other periods, certainly the Byzantine period, than we know about the Nabatean period. Part of the reason is because we don't have that many inscriptions. Even though there is a written language, we don't have texts. We don't have written serious texts, not just kind of some names that you find on tombs. So we don't know very much about the Nabateans. But what we do have is little bits of beautiful kind of painted Nabatean pottery. And they're everywhere in the Laura Safi, in the Dead Sea areas. And now we are able to identify sites, forts, occupations, and even cemeteries associated to the Nabatean people. But this is new. And we're able to identify really the entire eastern side of from Wadi Mujib to the Laura Safi, there are a number of sites. On the west in Palestine, the Negev was a great center for the Nabateans. So as Petra and its hinterland, there's the Negev in the southern Palestine, and the Dead Sea area are now coming to light. The Nabateans occupied it for certain trading reasons.
Yeah, can we trace some inscriptions that were found for the period of the Nabatean king Aretas IV, who ruled in late first century BC, 9 BC to 40 AD.
Yeah, we don't. As I said earlier, the inscriptions are not many as particularly in Nabatean script. Yeah. We have few. There are some that have been found more recently, but associating to Aretas and other Nabatean kings is very difficult. Stone inscriptions, but we do have coins. We have coins that were minted with Aretas IV, and we have the pottery which I mentioned, which is also dated to this period. So inscriptions are rare, very rare, but we have indications of this period of Aretas, first century, late first century, from coins and pottery on both sides of the Dead Sea.
Regarding the Roman period, how important Zoara was during that time, during the Roman conquest of Nabatean kingdom in 102 AD? Since we have Roman jewelry and drinking bowls and coins.
Well, Zoara, which is the modern Safi, the southeastern end of this area which we're talking about, was well established in the Roman period, the Nabatean period and the Roman period, as a trading town. It's mentioned in Roman texts. It's mentioned in some papyrus, some scrolls that were found in the Dead Sea. Zoara is mentioned by name. It's mentioned for its agricultural products, such as dates. It's also placed on maps. The Peutinger map, it shows it on main road networks. So Zoara was really the center for the south end of the Dead Sea, connecting it with Nabatea, with Petra, and the Negev, another great area of the Nabateans. So it was on maps, it's mentioned in texts, and it's geographically a crossroads.
During the Byzantine time, or let's say transition between the Roman period, classical Roman period, and the emergence of the Eastern Roman Empire, since even the Byzantines didn't call themselves Byzantines, but this is another topic. How important was Zoara in pre-Islamic time?
Well, I can very clearly say that there was a continuity from Nabatean Roman times right through to Byzantine or early Byzantine period through the 7th century. We have almost 1,000 years really of continuity. So even though there were new centers of power in the West, not Rome, but Byzantium, and there were new labels, Byzantine, it was still essentially an Eastern Roman, Eastern classical traditions. The people stayed. We have Greek, Latin names, but many, many Nabatean names written in Greek. In fact, 50% of the inscriptions that we get during the Byzantine Christian period are actually Arabic and Nabatean names, names such as the kings of the Nabateans. So we have Ulpius, of course, being a Latin name, but we also have Abodus, Avodianos. We have names such as Abdullah. So they continue. There's a great continuity, and there was no reason not to continue the trade that was developed during the Nabatean and Roman period with the West.
Do we have a gap between the Byzantine period and later on Mamluk rule of the region?
For this area, for the Zoara Safi, the southern part of the Dead Sea, I suppose it mirrors what's happening in much of Jordan and the southern Levant. There is a continuity in the early Islamic period. For instance, we have very clearly objects, lamps, pottery that belong to this early Umayyad period, which was very rich. And they continued. Some of the churches were actually rebuilt, mosaics were repaved, or they used the buildings to live in. And this goes up until the Umayyad, maybe early Abbasid period. But then there is a break around 750, around the 8th century. There is a break, and I guess it does, the archaeological record, for instance, we have silting, windblown sands, or there's an abandonment. There's an abandonment in churches, there's abandonment, and it may very well correspond to the Abbasid revolution in 750, which moves its capital of the Islamic world from Damascus to Baghdad. It's a major kind of new center. So this part of the southern Jordan, southern Levant, including the Zoara Safi, becomes a backwater, becomes actually very quiet. But not for very long. By the Fatimid period, by the 10th, 11th century, it comes back.
Can you say more about the baptistry in Zoara Episcopal Church that you worked on? And I had seen that site in person once. We went there in early 2017.
Right. Well, when we say Episcopal Church, it means the bishop's church. We know from the records. In Nicaea, which is now modern Iznik in modern Turkey. Nicaea, they had councils every so often, certainly every year. The church, the priests would assemble, the bishops would assemble, and they would decide major issues about the Christian church. And there were lists of the bishops who attended, and we know that the bishop of Zoara attended these councils in Nicaea, Nicene, or modern Iznik. So we know that there were bishops there. It was important enough to have a bishopric. There was a bishop. Now, we have a church that we uncovered a couple of years ago, which could be the bishop's church, the Episcopal church, as you said. But more recently, there was a second church that was also discovered with an inscription. This is not very well known because it's not published yet, but we have at least two churches that seem to be major churches, either of which either were the bishop's church or belonged to the bishopric. We also have Lot's monastery church, which was a major church and mentions a bishop. So we have at least three churches that belong to the bishopric, the episcopacy of Zoara. Which one was the seat of the bishop? That future excavations will tell us. Right now, we don't know, but these are major churches. So one of them, certainly the bishop would have sat in one or all of these at one point.
Do we have enough information about the size of the Christian community in Zoara in that time?
Well, the numbers, obviously it was an important enough town, Zoara, that it had a bishop, because I think you need to have a certain amount of, certain level, certain population. So to have a bishop, had be a seat of a bishop, it was a substantial population. What the numbers were, tens of thousands, difficult to say. We have, from the cemetery of this period, the 5th to 7th centuries AD, we have about 500 tombstones. But that doesn't mean there were 500 people. It's over a period of a couple of hundred years. So we would assume there were several thousand people, at least. I don't know the population size, but thousands of people, thousands for sure.
Can you say more about a very important site for various monotheistic religions? And that's the Rhodes page and Rhodes cave, sorry. Rhodes cave, and do we have enough evidence that the Rhodes lived in that area, or it's just some kind of tradition and speculation that comes out of monotheistic heritage?
Okay, here we begin to maybe, I don't know if this is the right word, is deviate, but we begin to leave scientific archaeology a little bit because we're looking at religion. And we're talking about at least 2 or 3 religions, certainly the monotheist, the three Abrahamic monotheistic religions. And, without offending any of these people, but at the same time, without proving it, we presented our publications and our evidence, and what it shows is that in the 5th to 6th, 7th centuries AD, during this early Christian period, the local people, the monks, the people who were Christians, believed that this was the cave where Lot and his family, his daughters, took refuge after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what they believed. And we know that because they dedicated a church to him. We have inscriptions which mention Lot. We have the Madaba map, which mentions Lot and the city of Zoara. So in this time, the people believed it. We also have the mention of the prophet Lot in the Quran. So even in the early Islamic period, we have a veneration of the prophet Lot. And in Lot's cave itself, once the church is abandoned, we have Arabic writing, graffiti on the walls, but actually Bismillah, Islamic invocations, not Christian Arabic. So we also have Islamic invocations. People must have visited the site and worshipped it as a holy site for Islam as well, as it is today, by the way.
Yeah, it's a holy site for 3 monotheistic religions, no doubt. what I wanted to ask you also is about your major project, which is a sugar factory in Gorsafi. And can you tell us more about the importance of sugar production during medieval period?
Well, looking at the Gorsafi, biblical and ancient Zoara, over a period of 12,000 years, what has become obvious, and what I've said just earlier too, is that there were springs, there were fresh water. This fresh water allowed, at certain periods at least, allowed people to live, to grow their agricultural products, to have a population that was founded on agricultural products. And the Wadi al-Hassa, or the biblical Zered, if you want, is a non-stop perennial water source. So from the Neolithic period, 12,000 years ago, in the early Bronze Age period, and the Byzantine period, it was founded, its wealth and its establishment, its success was founded on agricultural products. In the Roman period, it was famous for its dates. And if you look at the Madaba map, in Roman, late Roman, Byzantine period, you have date palms. In the early Islamic period, we have texts, the Cairo Geniza, and we have our now archaeological evidence that it was produced the best indigo. Indigo is a plant which is a dye. There's a chemical process where you can grow and rot this plant, and it becomes a dye for textiles, for clothes. It was very famous. The next big product in line that was produced in the Gorsafi in the medieval period, in the Ayyubid Mamluk period, is sugarcane. Now, sugarcane, like indigo, this plant, was brought in from India. India is a great source of culture, of trade, of innovation. And the sugar industry, or at least the process of extracting sugar from sugar canes, came from India via the Islamic world, via Iraq and Mesopotamia. And in the Gorsafi, it became a major production center, perhaps the biggest. And sugar cane, which is produces very high concentration of sugar, of sucrose, was processed, grown, processed, milled, crushed, boiled, and made into a crystallized white sugar that we know in the Gorsafi. Now, there are other sugar factories, dozens in the Jordan Valley, but it seems to be that was the biggest one.
For Ayyubid Mamluk state, how important was the monopoly on sugar production? And how important was the sugar trade between the Levant and Europe?
Well, it's difficult to realize how important sugar was in the medieval, well, when it was first being developed in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries AD, in the medieval period. It was a major world product. It was, the Europeans did not have it. Honey was the only way you could sweeten, or maybe some other fruits, you were able to sweeten your foods or perhaps your drinks. But because sugarcane and sugar production was highly efficient, and you could just put a little bit of sugar into your food and it would make it more attractive, more, it's a nice thing, but also it was addictive, but also gave more energy to your workers, for instance. So the sugar product was a very big, very important trade product, which the Arabs during the Ayyubid Mamluk period developed, which they monopolized on, and was exported to Europe. Eventually, the Europeans, via the Crusaders, learned the technique, the process, and started producing it in Sicily and Rhodos and other places in the West. But for the moment, for a couple of hundred years, the Ayyubid Mamluks and the Arabs, particularly in the Jordan Valley, had this monopoly. Now, we know that this was a state monopoly, and it was a state-sponsored monopoly, for at least two good reasons. One, if you go to the, when we can go again, inshallah, to the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, as you enter, there is a column which actually mentions the sugar industry in the Jordan Valley, and that it was under the protection of the state, of the Islamic Mamluk state. On our excavations, or in our excavations the last few years, we also discovered stamps on clay, which seemed to be official, they say hatim, which seemed to be official government stamps that would have probably sealed the rooms where this valuable sugar was stored. The best parallel is when you get these big trucks that travel through the country and they have valuable products inside, and they put a little lead seal in the back so you don't open it until you reach its destination. So this official seal is similar to, I think, what we found in the Lower Safi.
Why the sugar industry collapsed after 1517 and the Ottoman occupation of the southern Levant? It was flourishing during Ayyubid Mamluk time, and suddenly, when Ottomans took over, we had a problem, or the sugar industry in Jordan Valley, and
yeah, this is a question now that we're trying to understand more clearly. Certainly in the Lower Safi, by the 15th century, just at the eve of the Ottoman conquest of the area, it had stopped. Probably what had happened, things don't happen overnight. There already were probably trade networks were cut during this 15th to 16th centuries AD. But perhaps more important was that the Europeans, the Crusaders and the Europeans began to produce sugar in the West, in the Mediterranean, in Spain, in Sicily, in the Aegean, in Crete. So they broke the monopoly that the Arabs had, that the Muslim world had, by producing it in the West. That was coupled by a new people, the Ottoman Turks, or the Turks that came into the area and didn't give as much. Well, actually, it became kind of a backwater in the 16th century. We don't know much about it. It became poor economically. It was cut off, and they focused much more on what is now Eastern modern Turkey or Anatolia, and the trade networks, in the north of what is now Syria, Aleppo, Mosul. These areas were much more important during the Ottoman, from the early times, from the Seljuk and Ottoman periods, than this part of the southern Levant.
So they shifted the production, and they shifted the economy, and they shifted the importance to these regions instead of.
It was happening already. I don't want to say. I don't think we should say that they did it. They shifted it, and there's also the climate factor, because if we look at the climate, it was also beginning to get drier. So all these things all these things put together, the trade with the Europeans developing and the Ottomans having other interests, the climate changing, because the climate's always changing. It's not stable. All these factors made this area by the 16th century not terribly important. Certainly, there's something happening down there, but it's not what it was before.
I would like to ask you for the end, what are your plans regarding recently launched book? You mentioned that you're planning the volume 2 and volume 3.
Well, this very handsome volume, if I can say, published by the world's biggest English language company, Routledge, which is the most prestigious academic company, which also makes it quite expensive. This book, it's volume 1 only because it was the information we had was too big for one single volume. It was going to be 600 pages. So it was a matter of physically not being able to print and actually sell one volume. So we split it in 2 volumes. So this first volume has the archaeology, the introduction, the climate, all the things I've been talking about today, and the archaeological reports and the architecture, but not the material object finds. Volume 2 is a continuity of this. So you must have both books. It's going to have the pottery, the animal bones, the botany, everything that we found that has to do with the actual material evidence from the excavations. So volume 2 is essential and it's part of volume 1. Whoever buys volume 1 must buy volume 2. Volume 3 is now planned. It will happen because we have a budget for it. That will be more specialized finds, and we're going to have a conference on Zoara in 2 years, which will be the product of that conference will be volume 3. But that's separate. Volume 3 will be separate. The volume 1 and 2 are definitely out virtually together now. They're finished. I also have to mention that the American Center for Oriental Research, actually this just changed its name, the American Center for Research in Amman, or ACORP, has just completed an overall more popular book on Zoara and all of what we've been talking about, all I've been talking about, and in a much more concise way, within less than 100 pages, in color, more attractive, and I think at a much, much better price. So we have also another publication which is actually completed. So by the end of this year, actually probably in days, if not weeks, this will also be available, and it will be also called Zoara.
Thank you so much for your time. It's our first conversation, but not the last. We're planning to cover all your researches and work, not only in Jordan, but in other places as well, including Greece. That will be another topic for coming weeks, of course, if you have time. And,
of course, for you always.
Yeah, I always have time, especially on Fridays. When I socialize with interesting people like your good self. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.